By dawn, the jagged peaks of Qeshm Island were nothing but hollow, smoking craters. Two massive craters smoked on the highest ridges, surrounded by the melted steel husks of 11 heavy rocket batteries. Burning solid rocket fuel spilled down the vertical cliff faces, cascading like liquid fire into the dark, churning waters of the Strait of Hormuz below. Debris fields of shattered concrete and twisted rebar stretched for miles across the island coastline. The battle had lasted less than 12 minutes, but it had entirely flattened one of the most heavily fortified coastal artillery fortresses in the Middle East. The question was not how the reinforced bunkers had failed beneath the sheer explosive force. The question was how an entire network of overlapping air defense radars had been completely blind until the moment the mountains cracked open. To understand how the island was systematically dismantled from the sky, the timeline has to rewind to 2:15 in the morning. 2:15 in the morning on the 21st of June, 2026, high above the central Persian Gulf. The night was pitch black, with a heavy marine layer completely obscuring the stars and the vast expanse of water below. Cruising at 35,000 feet, a strike package of United States F-35 stealth fighters pushed eastward in total radio silence. There were no lights flashing on their wings. There were no external pylons creating radar drag. The aircraft cut through the freezing, thin air like black blades, their internal weapon bays loaded with heavy precision-guided bunker-busting munitions. Inside the cockpits, the pilots sat in total silence, listening only to the steady rhythm of their own breathing through oxygen masks, and the low, distant hum of the single jet engine behind them. They were moving at over 900 kilometers per hour, closing the distance to the critical maritime choke point without making a single sound on the electromagnetic spectrum. Directly below their flight path, guarding the narrow entrance to the Persian Gulf, sat Qeshm Island. It was an impregnable fortress of rock, tunneled deep by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps over 2 decades. Inside the mountainsides, heavy shore-to-ship rocket launchers and anti-ship missile batteries waited behind thick hydraulic blast doors. The entire complex was designed to lock down the shipping lanes and saturate any naval formation that dared to enter the strait. Deep inside the subterranean command bunker on the island, the regional air defense network was fully active. Giant phased array radar dishes spun continuously on the coastal peaks, pumping massive amounts of electromagnetic energy into the thick night sky. The radar operators sat in a room bathed in cold blue light, breathing air that smelled faintly of diesel exhaust and hot electronics, watching the digital sweeps of the airspace. At 2:22 in the morning, the master radar scope flickered. It was not a hard target. It was a phantom signal, a brief atmospheric anomaly that appeared for half a second before vanishing back into the background clutter. The senior operator leaned closer to his glass screen, wiping sweat from his forehead. He adjusted the gain, trying to burn through the interference. The digital system registered nothing, but 3 seconds later, another faint ghost track registered, this time 50 kilometers closer to the island shoreline. It was moving too fast to be a migrating bird, and far too erratic to be a commercial airliner navigating the Gulf corridors. The operator slammed his hand onto the internal communications dial. He did not have a confirmed lock, and he did not have a solid tracking profile, but the mathematical pattern was enough to trigger a localized threat warning. The piercing, high-pitched shriek of the combat alarm instantly ripped through the concrete tunnels of the underground complex. Red emergency lights flared to life in the humid corridors. The sleeping garrison was violently jolted awake as officers screamed over the loudspeakers, their voices echoing off the wet stone walls, ordering all surface-to-air missile crews and coastal rocket batteries to immediately man their battle stations. The invisible stealth package was still rapidly dropping altitude, but the island fortress was now fully awake, and the lethal surface trap was preparing to spring open. The piercing shriek of the combat alarm continued to echo through the subterranean corridors of Qeshm Island as the entire military machine violently woke up. Deep inside the mountain, hundreds of Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps soldiers sprinted down the damp concrete tunnels. The heavy thud of combat boots hammered against steel grating, mixing with the frantic shouts of unit commanders barking orders over the blaring sirens. The air quickly filled with the sharp stench of unburnt diesel fuel and hot grease as dozens of massive engines roared to life at the same time. The island was no longer a dormant rock in the middle of the Gulf. It was a waking, armored beast. Along the jagged western ridgeline, the physical face of the mountain began to shift. Giant hydraulic rams whined in the darkness, grinding against decades of loose rock and salt air. Massive, camouflaged blast doors that had been perfectly blended into the cliffside slowly pushed outward and rolled back along heavy steel tracks. As the doors opened, harsh red emergency lights spilled out into the black night, cutting through the dense marine layer rolling off the ocean. From the depths of the armored bunkers, 11 heavy mobile rocket batteries crawled forward out of the earth. These were the primary coastal defense weapons, massive transport erector launchers, mounted on heavily armored 8-wheeled trucks. Their diesel engines bellowed, vibrating the loose gravel on the cliff edges as they positioned themselves on the pre-surveyed firing pads over the drop-offs. As soon as the heavy trucks locked their air brakes, the launch crews went to work in the sweltering heat. Men scrambled over the wet steel decks of the vehicles, aggressively pulling safety pins and snapping heavy green data cables into the firing computers. The heavy hydraulic arms of the launchers began to whine, slowly elevating the massive rectangular launch pods into the sky. Within 90 seconds, dozens of heavy rocket tubes were angled aggressively over the dark water of the Strait of Hormuz, ready to saturate the narrow shipping lanes with high explosives. At the same time, the secondary defense grid activated. Smaller, highly mobile anti-aircraft artillery units raced up the winding mountain switchbacks, their massive tires throwing dirt and rocks over the steep edges. They deployed rapidly along the secondary ridges, their twin, radar-guided gun barrels tracking violently back and forth across the black sky. Surface-to-air missile crews threw heavy metal switches in their command vehicles, desperately trying to lock onto the phantom radar contacts that had triggered the alarm. Their search radars spun continuously, pumping maximum power into the atmosphere, trying to burn through the electronic fog and find a target to kill. The entire coastal trap was now fully set and armed. Thousands of tons of high explosives and highly volatile solid rocket fuel were exposed on the mountain peaks, wired into the grid and ready to fire at a moment's notice. Below them, the dark water of the strait crashed against the jagged rocks, entirely indifferent to the lethal standoff building above. Inside the mobile radar vans, operators sweated under the harsh glow of their green screens, constantly adjusting their frequencies, begging the system to show them a hard tracking box. The defenders stood ready by their control panels, their hands hovering over the launch mechanisms, staring out at the pitch-black horizon. They were perfectly positioned to annihilate any naval convoy or low-flying strike group that dared to enter the kill zone. But their massive radar dishes were scanning the water and the low-altitude approach vectors. They were looking outward, relying on the geometry of a traditional naval war, entirely unaware that the true threat was not coming from the sea, but was already dropping silently through the freezing darkness directly above their heads. As the Iranian defenders frantically scanned the black horizon for incoming warships, the strike package of American F-35 stealth fighters was already directly overhead, preparing to completely blind the island. At 25,000 feet, the stealth aircraft leveled out, maintaining absolute radio silence while their interconnected combat networks synchronized the final attack geometry. The pilots did not need to speak to one another. Their advanced helmet visors projected a shared, three-dimensional map of the battlefield, directly across their field of vision, linking every aircraft into a single, cohesive firing unit. Before the heavy bomb bay doors could open, the invisible battle of the electromagnetic spectrum began. The flight lead initiated a devastating, concentrated wave of localized electronic jamming, firing invisible beams of microwave energy downward toward the jagged peaks of Qeshm Island. The concentrated interference slammed directly into the spinning phased array radar dishes of the Revolutionary Guard Corps. Inside the subterranean command bunkers, the physical effect was immediate and catastrophic. The pristine digital sweeps on the master control screens violently dissolved into endless, rolling waves of useless green static. False target tracks instantly flooded the primary air defense grid by the thousands, completely overwhelming the aging processors and triggering endless automated alarm sirens that echoed through the concrete tunnels. The Iranian radar operators screamed in frustration, wiping sweat from their faces as their entire digital vision of the airspace was violently ripped away. They aggressively twisted frequency dials and slammed heavy switches, desperately attempting to channel hop and burn through the heavy interference. But the stealth electronic attack was too dense. A sharp smell of hot ozone and melting insulation filled the crowded control vans as the receiver circuits overloaded. Analog radios hissed with deafening white noise, cutting off the local battery commanders from the central mountain headquarters. The massive rocket launchers resting on the exposed cliff edges were now entirely isolated in the dark, stripped of their early warning networks, and completely deaf to the sky above them. While the defenders drowned in electronic chaos, the American pilots smoothly transitioned to the final physical targeting phase. The advanced electro-optical targeting sensors mounted beneath the noses of the stealth fighters rotated silently on their mechanical gimbals, peering straight down through the freezing air and the thick, wet marine layer. The advanced infrared cameras ignored the electronic noise entirely and focused only on the thermal radiation rising from the rock. Inside the quiet, cold cockpits, the high-resolution thermal displays lit up with deadly clarity. Against the pitch-black background of the cooling mountain stone, the heat signatures of the 11 Iranian mobile rocket batteries glowed like glaring white beacons. The sensitive thermal lenses clearly identified the massive diesel transport engines idling on the firing pads, the heat leaking off the armored crew cabins, and the mechanical friction of the hydraulic arms that had just elevated the heavy rocket tubes into the firing position. The targeting computers automatically drew perfectly crisp white boxes around each heavy vehicle, locking the thermal contrast into the system memory. The pilots moved their gloved thumbs over the red weapon release buttons on their flight sticks. The targeting systems immediately fed the precise geometric coordinates down into the guidance fins of the heavy bunker-busting munitions resting inside the dark internal weapon bays. Complex firing computers calculated wind shear, altitude drop, air density, and the exact angle of the steep mountain ridges in milliseconds. The electronic battle was finished. The island fortress was completely boxed in, and the isolated coastal launchers were now only seconds away from catastrophic physical destruction. With the island's electronic defense grid completely shattered and the heat signatures of the exposed rocket batteries perfectly locked on the thermal displays, the silent phase of the operation finally ended. Inside the lead F-35, the strike commander verified the synchronization of the targeting data across the entire squadron network. The pilots breathed steadily into their oxygen masks, their eyes locked on the artificial horizon lines projected onto their visors. A single encrypted digital command was broadcast across the data link, requiring absolutely no voice transmission. The green authorization lights illuminated simultaneously on the glass instrument panels of every stealth fighter in the formation. The pilots firmly pressed their thumbs down onto the red weapon release buttons located on their flight sticks. Instantly, the smooth, radar-absorbent bellies of the stealth aircraft mechanically shifted. The heavy internal weapon bay doors violently snapped open against the rushing air, exposing the dark, crowded racks of heavy munitions to the freezing high-altitude wind. The sudden aerodynamic drag caused the aircraft to shudder slightly, a brief physical vibration breaking their perfectly smooth glide. Suspended inside the bays were the 2,000-pound joint direct attack munitions. These were not standard high-explosive bombs. They were heavy, reinforced steel penetrators, cast from hardened alloys, and specifically designed to crack open thick layers of mountain rock and reinforced concrete before detonating deep inside the subterranean tunnel networks. Heavy mechanical clamps simultaneously released their hydraulic grip with a loud metallic clack. Gravity immediately took control. One by one, in rapid, staggered succession, dozens of heavy olive green bombs ripped away from the mechanical ejector racks and plunged downward into the pitch-black sky. As soon as the heavy weapons cleared the aircraft, the internal weapon bay doors instantly snapped shut again, sealing the stealth fighters back into their completely invisible aerodynamic profiles. The aircraft immediately banked away, turning their noses back toward the central Persian Gulf to avoid the upcoming blast wave. Their primary job completely finished. But the lethal payloads were just beginning their journey. For the first 2 seconds, the heavy steel bombs tumbled silently through the thin air. Then, the internal batteries activated. Small explosive charges fired along the tail sections, instantly deploying the aerodynamic control surfaces. 4 distinct guidance fins snapped outward with a sharp mechanical crack, violently catching the rushing wind. The GPS receivers inside the bomb tail kits immediately linked up with the satellite constellation high above the atmosphere, constantly comparing their exact geometric position with the target coordinates programmed just seconds earlier. The metallic guidance fins began to twitch and adjust rapidly, slicing through the freezing air as they precisely steered the heavy 2,000-pound warheads downward. They dropped through 20,000 feet, then 15,000. As the bombs accelerated toward terminal velocity, they violently punched through the wet marine layer rolling off the ocean. Below them, The bright red emergency lights of the Iranian mountain base glowed in the darkness like a sprawling, helpless target matrix. On the ground below, the Iranian missile crews were still frantically running across the wet steel decks of their massive transport vehicles. The deafening roar of the idling heavy diesel engines and the blaring sirens completely masked the high-pitched, tearing sound of the heavy bombs ripping through the atmosphere directly above them. The massive rocket launchers were still sitting fully exposed on the cliff edges, their hydraulic arms pointing uselessly at the black horizon. The cold, silent digital calculations of the stealth attack had just transformed into raw, unstoppable kinetic energy, plunging straight toward the solid rock. The high-pitched scream of the falling munitions was entirely masked by the blaring base sirens, until the exact millisecond, the heavy steel warheads slammed directly into the solid stone of the island. The first wave of 2,000-pound penetrator bombs did not immediately detonate on contact. Their hardened alloy noses violently punched straight through the upper layer of dirt, shattered the heavily camouflaged blast doors, and sliced deep into the reinforced concrete roofs of the primary subterranean launch silos. For a fraction of a second, there was only the deafening crunch of crushing rock. Then, the delayed action fuses triggered. Deep inside the mountain, thousands of pounds of high explosives detonated simultaneously in a confined space. The sheer kinetic energy had nowhere to go but up and out. The highest ridge of Qeshm Island physically bulged upward, expanding like a massive underground lung, before the structural integrity of the rock completely failed. The entire mountain peak violently blew apart in a blinding, earth-shattering flash of orange light. A towering fountain of vaporized concrete, pulverized limestone, and twisted rebar erupted hundreds of feet into the freezing night sky. The concussive shockwave ripped outward at supersonic speed, instantly flattening the surrounding guard towers and snapping the heavy communication antennas cleanly in half. Directly beneath the primary blast, the two largest mobile rocket batteries, heavy transport vehicles weighing dozens of tons, were instantly annihilated. The sheer heat and overpressure of the explosion melted their steel frames and tore their elevated hydraulic launch arms completely off their chassis. The heavy rectangular rocket pods violently ruptured, tossing unexploded ordnance straight into the raging fires. Iranian missile crews standing on the adjacent firing pads were violently thrown across the wet gravel by the invisible wall of pressure. Panic immediately swallowed the remaining defenders. The deafening roar of the blast echoed across the dark water of the Strait of Hormuz, quickly followed by the terrifying sound of thousands of tons of shattered rock and burning steel raining back down onto the lower slopes. Giant slabs of the cliff face sheared away entirely, tumbling downward and crashing violently into the black ocean below, sending towering columns of white water spraying into the humid air. The concussive force of the explosion rolled violently down the winding mountain switchbacks, blowing out the heavy windshields of the transport trucks and flattening the reinforced security fences. The subterranean power grid instantly failed, plunging the lower tunnels into total darkness before the massive, rolling fires cast a chaotic orange glow across the jagged rock walls. The air instantly became unbreathable, choking the survivors with the suffocating stench of burning diesel, shattered stone, and scorched metal. A third mobile launcher, caught just on the edge of the blast zone, was violently flipped onto its side by the shockwave. Its heavy tires spun uselessly in the air, while its massive fuel tanks ruptured, spilling highly flammable diesel rapidly across the steep cliff edge. The pristine, heavily fortified peak was instantly transformed into a massive, glowing crater. The defenders finally understood that they were not hunting a naval convoy, but were trapped under a massive, invisible aerial bombardment. But the surviving Iranian garrison did not simply surrender to the inferno tearing through their primary ridges. Cut off from their central command and completely blinded by the continuous electronic jamming, the remaining artillery commanders acted out of pure, frantic survival instinct. They knew they were trapped under an invisible bomber force, and their only defense was to fill the pitch-black sky with as much flying metal as possible. Along the lower mountain switchbacks, heavily camouflaged nets were violently thrown off the backup anti-aircraft positions. Mobile twin-barrel cannons, entirely disconnected from the ruined radar grid, were manually cranked upward by desperate gunners pulling hard on cold steel wheels. The operators slammed their boots down onto the heavy metal firing pedals, bypassing the dead digital computers entirely to open fire on the unseen threat. Instantly, a deafening mechanical clatter erupted across the island coastline. Dense, continuous streams of bright red tracer fire ripped upward into the freezing marine layer. Hundreds of heavy armor-piercing rounds crossed the sky in intersecting arcs, creating a massive, chaotic wall of blind flak over the dark water. Empty brass casings rained down onto the rocky firing pads in glowing torrents, burning through the damp earth while the gun barrels rapidly overheated, turning a dull, glowing orange in the darkness. The sharp, suffocating stench of burning cordite quickly mixed with the diesel smoke, choking the crews as they desperately fed fresh ammunition belts into the violently recoiling receivers. Higher up on the jagged cliffs, the surviving heavy rocket batteries realized their exposed munitions were now massive, highly volatile liabilities. Without targeting data, leaving the fully loaded pods on the launchers meant certain death from the approaching secondary explosions. The isolated battery commanders made the desperate decision to manually launch everything they had into the dark to empty their tubes. Heavy steel firing keys were turned violently inside the vibrating armored crew cabins. One by one, the massive solid rocket motors ignited with blinding, white-hot flashes that temporarily washed out the red glow of the spreading base fires. The sheer thrust of the simultaneous launches physically pushed the heavy transport trucks backward on their heavy suspensions, violently cracking the asphalt beneath their massive tires. Dozens of heavy, unguided surface-to-surface rockets screamed outward from the cliff edges, their exhaust plumes melting the guardrails. With no radar guidance or target lock, they streaked erratically in completely random directions, cutting chaotic trails of thick white smoke over the Strait of Hormuz. Some spiraled wildly upward, detonating blindly in the upper atmosphere and throwing jagged showers of hot, expanding shrapnel through the low-hanging clouds. Others pitched downward almost immediately, slamming violently into the churning ocean miles away from any ship, throwing massive columns of illuminated seawater high into the air. The sky over Qeshm Island was instantly transformed from a silent, invisible kill box into a terrifying, three-dimensional hazard zone. High above the chaotic light show, the American stealth pilots watched their internal threat displays suddenly light up with localized collision warnings. Though the Iranian defenders could not track them, the sheer, dense volume of blind fire was massive enough to pose a genuine physical threat. The jets aggressively banked away, smoothly pushing their throttles forward and climbing sharply through the thin air to clear the lethal dome of exploding flak, ensuring they were safely out of the way before the finishing strike arrived. As the primary stealth fighters pulled safely above the dome of exploding flak, the true eradication of the island's surface defenses began. The first wave had cracked the mountain open and shattered the command network, but the heavy lifting of absolute destruction belonged to the follow-on strike elements. Cutting fiercely through the dense smoke and low-hanging marine layer, a squadron of United States Navy F-18 strike fighters roared into the airspace. They did not need to hide in the electronic shadows. The Iranian radar network was completely dead, and the target area was brightly illuminated by the raging fires on the highest peaks. The strike pilots aggressively pitched their noses downward, diving directly into the chaotic airspace, their advanced optical sensors immediately locking onto the frantic movement crawling along the mountain roads. On the winding switchbacks below, the surviving Iranian rocket batteries were desperately attempting a chaotic retreat. The massive, heavily armored transport trucks ground their gears, trying to reverse away from the exposed cliff edges and squeeze back into the surviving subterranean tunnels. Heavy, grooved tires violently spun and slipped on the steep asphalt, throwing loose gravel and shattered concrete over the sheer drops. Diesel engines screamed under the extreme mechanical load as panicked drivers violently wrestled with their heavy steering wheels. But the narrow mountain roads were choked with massive boulders and burning debris from the primary blast, completely trapping the heavy vehicles out in the open. The strike fighters did not give the defenders time to reach the safety of the heavy steel blast doors. The pilots locked their thermal sights onto the glowing engine blocks of the crawling convoy and squeezed their weapon release triggers. This second wave did not carry heavy concrete penetrators. They carried advanced tactical cluster munitions and hundreds of smaller, precision-guided glide bombs designed specifically to shred exposed surface targets. The heavy cylindrical dispensers cleanly separated from the wing pylons of the diving jets, plunging into the thick smoke before violently splitting open in midair with a series of sharp mechanical cracks. Thousands of hardened submunitions scattered across the night sky, spreading out into a massive, lethal net before raining down over the steep slopes. The explosions hit the winding switchbacks like a rolling, relentless carpet of fire. The munitions walked brutally down the mountain roads, completely engulfing the retreating rocket batteries. Sharp, deafening detonations echoed continuously as armor-piercing fragments violently punched right through the exposed engine blocks of the heavy trucks. Massive diesel fuel tanks violently ruptured under the barrage, instantly igniting into bright orange fireballs that completely swallowed the armored crew cabins. The unprotected anti-aircraft artillery crews stationed along the secondary ridges were instantly shredded by the sweeping wave of fragmentation, their spinning radar dishes shattered and their ammunition belts cooking off in chaotic bursts of secondary fire. One of the massive transport erector launchers, its engine completely destroyed by the sweeping barrage, instantly lost all hydraulic brake pressure. The 80-ton vehicle violently careened backward down the steep grade, smashing straight through the heavy concrete guardrails before plummeting over the cliff edge. It tumbled end over end, shattering against the jagged rocks before plunging into the black water of the strait below. On the roads above, hydraulic lines burst on the surviving launchers, spraying highly flammable fluid across hot exhaust pipes. The island was no longer a fortified base. It was an inescapable burning trap, and the entire surface defense capability of Qeshm Island was being systematically wiped from the rock. With the surface roads transformed into a sprawling corridor of burning wreckage, the true destruction of Qeshm Island began to violently unfold from the inside out. The fires from the shattered launchers on the exposed cliff faces did not just burn out in the open air. They actively bled backward into the exposed subterranean entrances. Rivers of burning diesel and flaming hydraulic fluid flowed down the steep gradients of the shattered concrete ramps, pooling directly into the deep underground loading bays. The primary blast doors that had once sealed these caverns had been completely ripped away by the initial heavy penetrator bombs, leaving the island's massive internal ammunition magazines entirely exposed to the spreading inferno. Deep inside the mountain, the ambient temperature inside the storage bunkers rapidly spiked. Hundreds of heavy artillery shells and unguided rocket warheads stacked along the damp walls began to sweat in the extreme heat. Minutes later, the thermal load reached a critical threshold, and the smaller munitions began to spontaneously detonate. Sharp, localized cracks echoed violently through the wet stone corridors, throwing jagged, hot shrapnel across the cavernous loading zones. This flying metal violently tore directly into the massive, stacked pallets of highly volatile solid rocket booster fuel that had been staged in the adjacent corridors for the next day's deployment. Once the chemical solid fuel ignited, it did not just burn. It reacted with terrifying speed, creating a self-oxidizing inferno that required absolutely no outside oxygen. A blinding, white-hot flash suddenly illuminated the deepest recesses of the mountain, instantly vaporizing the remaining steel storage racks. A massive, unstoppable shockwave of superheated gas and expanding fire roared down the primary access tunnels like a runaway freight train. At the lower vehicle entrances near the coastline, the surviving heavy steel blast doors were violently blown clean off their massive hinges. The thick steel plates, weighing several tons each, were thrown hundreds of feet out into the night air, spinning wildly before crashing down onto the coastal highway. Immediately behind them, a continuous, roaring jet of white-hot fire violently vented from the tunnel mouths. The mountain itself acted like a massive exhaust nozzle, blasting a terrifying horizontal pillar of flame straight out over the black water of the Strait of Hormuz. The sheer acoustic roar of the venting pressure overpowered everything else on the island, vibrating the bedrock so violently that the surrounding seawater began to violently ripple and foam. The internal structural integrity of the military complex finally completely gave way. Deep limestone walls buckled inward under the extreme overpressure. Heavy reinforced concrete support columns snapped with deafening, sequential cracks that sounded like subterranean thunder. The upper cliff faces physically groaned beneath the intense heat and pressure before entirely shearing away from the mountain. Thousands of tons of loose rock, shattered concrete, and twisted rebar violently cascaded down the steep slopes in a massive, sweeping avalanche. The heavy landslide completely buried the burning husks of the destroyed mobile rocket batteries and swallowed the lower coastal switchbacks, dragging the flaming wreckage straight down into the churning ocean. The surviving defenders completely abandoned any remaining illusion of holding their ground. There was no longer a unified command structure to give orders, and there were no heavy weapons left to fire. The scattered anti-aircraft crews simply dropped their heavy ammunition belts and frantically scrambled down the treacherous dirt paths on foot, desperate to outrun the collapsing infrastructure. The base was no longer fighting back. The fortress had completely lost all military cohesion, rapidly tearing itself apart as the internal magazines cooked off in an endless chain reaction of violent explosions that continuously shook the island to its core. As the massive internal magazines completely tore the subterranean complex apart, the immediate heavy firing across the airspace finally slowed to a halt. High above the chaotic inferno, the strike package of F-35 stealth fighters and FA-18 strike jets smoothly banked away, entirely untouched by the desperate anti-aircraft barrage. The pilots looked back over their shoulders through the thick canopy glass, watching the dark silhouette of Qeshm Island glow with violent white and orange heat. Their high-resolution thermal displays continuously recorded the total physical devastation. What had once been a pristine, heavily fortified mountain ridge was now a series of deep, white-hot craters, bleeding, burning solid rocket fuel directly down the steep cliff faces into the boiling sea. The invisible aerial threat pushed their throttles forward, riding the massive thermal updrafts generated by the burning fortress, and disappeared back into the pitch-black sky over the central Persian Gulf, their devastating mission completely executed. Down on the shattered surface of the island, the military engagement was over, but the battlefield remained a highly lethal, chaotic hazard zone. Surviving local emergency response units frantically deployed from the sheltered far side of the island. Dozens of heavy Iranian military ambulances and heavy water tankers desperately tried to navigate the winding coastal highway, their blue and red emergency lights flashing weakly against the towering walls of thick black smoke. The heavy tires of the rescue vehicles violently crunched over shattered limestone, twisted metal guardrails, and hundreds of jagged armor-piercing fragments that completely littered the cracked asphalt. The steep mountain switchbacks leading to the primary firing pads were completely impassable. Massive slabs of reinforced concrete from the collapsed underground bunkers completely blocked the higher elevations, physically trapping the rescue crews at the base of the cliffs. Deep inside the remaining open tunnels, the secondary fires continued to violently rage out of control. Dense, suffocating black smoke poured continuously out of the shattered mountain, heavily laced with the highly toxic chemical residue of burning solid rocket propellants. Firefighters wearing heavy breathing apparatuses and thick heat-resistant suits struggled violently to pull heavy canvas hoses over the jagged rubble, but the sheer thermal radiation pushing out of the caverns physically forced the crews backward. The high-pressure water streams hissed loudly and instantly turned into blinding white steam long before they could reach the melted chassis of the heavy rocket launchers. Medical personnel frantically scrambled over the loose, unstable scree, their boots slipping on the wet rocks as they desperately searched the lower slopes for survivors. They dragged wounded and completely disoriented air defense crews away from the spreading pools of burning diesel, hauling them forcefully onto the flatbeds of the surviving transport trucks. The rescue operation was incredibly slow and highly dangerous. Every few minutes, sharp, terrifying mechanical cracks violently echoed from the higher ridges, as unexploded cluster munitions and damaged heavy artillery shells randomly cooked off in the extreme heat. These sudden, blind detonations threw fresh showers of lethal shrapnel down onto the exposed rescue teams, forcing the paramedics to drop to the wet ground and cover their heads. The surviving Revolutionary Guard Corps officers could only stand helplessly by the lower roadblocks, screaming furiously into handheld analog radios that received only hissing static in return. The primary command structure was entirely gone. The radar arrays were completely melted slag. There was absolutely no capability left to coordinate a defense, and simply pulling the living out from under the burning, collapsing rock had suddenly become an overwhelming, nearly impossible battle against the shattered environment. The island was no longer a threat. It was simply a sprawling, burning graveyard of twisted military hardware. While the desperate rescue operations struggled against the collapsing rock of Qeshm Island, the absolute physical destruction of the fortress sent an immediate shockwave outward across the entire region. The massive fires burning across the jagged peaks were not just a localized disaster. They were a towering, highly visible beacon illuminating one of the most critical energy choke points on the planet. From dozens of miles away, the dark water of the Strait of Hormuz was cast in a chaotic, flickering orange light. Giant commercial oil tankers, massive vessels stretching hundreds of meters long, slowly navigated the narrow shipping lanes directly beneath the devastated island. Sailors standing on the high, dark bridges of these merchant ships stared in absolute silence at the burning coastline. The towering flames perfectly reflected off their heavy steel decks and the black waves, visually confirming that the lethal coastal trap had been completely eradicated. Hundreds of miles away, deep inside the heavily fortified regional command hubs of the Revolutionary Guard Corps, the strategic reality of the strike violently settled over the silent control rooms. The master digital maps, which just an hour ago showed a dense, overlapping web of impenetrable air defense zones and anti-ship missile arcs, were now completely dark over the primary entrance to the Persian Gulf. The secure communication lines to the island remained entirely dead. There were no damage reports being transmitted. There were no requests for reinforcements. There was only the chilling, absolute silence that follows the total annihilation of a frontline command structure. Senior military officers stared at their blank digital screens, fully comprehending the massive vulnerability that had just been exposed. The island of Qeshm had been heavily engineered for decades to be the ultimate coastal deterrent. It was entirely designed to bleed any approaching naval convoy and lock down the shipping lanes with an overwhelming volume of heavy rocket fire. But the fortress had not been destroyed by a massive naval bombardment or a protracted amphibious invasion. It had been systematically dismantled in less than 12 minutes by a completely invisible aerial force that struck from the high altitude, bypassed all early warning networks, and shattered the hardened bunkers before a single defensive weapon could be accurately fired. The global strategic equation shifted violently overnight. The total destruction of the 11 rocket batteries proved that deeply buried subterranean tunnels and heavy blast doors were no longer enough to protect the most lethal coastal weapons. Allied naval formations that had been holding their positions safely out in the Arabian Sea were now entirely free to push forward through the strait. Without facing the threat of overwhelming shore-to-ship saturation fire, the invisible strike had effectively kicked the heavy armored door to the Gulf completely open. But as the dawn finally broke over the smoldering, melted craters of Qeshm Island, the atmosphere was not filled with celebration. The heavy, suffocating smoke rolling off the coast carried a much darker warning. A massive red line had been violently crossed, and an entirely new threshold of destructive precision had been demonstrated to the world. The absolute eradication of the island fortress left the surviving regional forces on maximum alert, gripping their remaining weapons in the dark, fully aware that a much larger and far more devastating war could still easily ignite from the burning wreckage spilling into the sea.